Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. Besides his no-nonsense approach towards battling corruption, Lee was also known to have taken a tough stance against communists in Singapore. These ideals have formed the foundation upon which Singapore was founded. But in details that became public only after Lee stepped away as Prime Minister, it was revealed that Singapore secretly sent weapons and provided military training to a movement that is associated with one of history's most notorious communists. Why was Singapore clandestinely involved in this conflict? And given prevailing territorial disputes between countries in the region and China, could Singapore find itself as a secret supplier of weapons once again? Stick around as we discuss why Singapore took on this role, and chances that history might repeat itself as conflicts simmer across the region. December 21, 1978. Two divisions from the Vietnam People's Army crossed the border into Cambodia, which was by then known as Kampuchea and ruled by the Khmer Rouge regime. Seeing how the initial incursion was met with little resistance, Vietnam followed up with a full-scale invasion of the country with 150,000 troops. The invasion was supported by modern Soviet-supplied weapons and vehicles, and was spectacular in how quickly Vietnam was able to overrun Cambodian defenses. Within 2 weeks of the invasion, Vietnam was in control of the capital city, Phnom Penh, and a pro-Vietnamese government was subsequently established in the country, with surviving leaders of the Khmer Rouge regime taking refuge in Thailand. The invasion raised alarm bells all over the world, especially in Southeast Asia. Vietnam was by then seen as a possible conduit of Soviet-style communism, and there were fears that Southeast Asian countries would eventually fall to the communists. Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia was seen as an early manifestation of the domino theory, positing that once a state falls to communism, the surrounding countries would follow. Watching this development closely were the leaders of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, countries that have each taken tough stances against communists in their midst. But among these countries, Singapore was in a particularly unique position. It was the only Southeast Asian country then with a functional military-industrial complex. After its sudden independence in 1965, the Singapore government founded a defense company to indigenously manufacture weapons and ammunition to support the country's defenses. The company was known as Chartered Industries, the predecessor to ST Engineering. And by 1979, Singapore had made its mark as a serious manufacturer of infantry weapons, with the Ultimax 100, which was then and still is the world's lowest recoil light machine gun. Given how Washington was still reluctant to openly supply weapons to the Khmer fighters, Singapore knew that it was the only Southeast Asian country that could arm Cambodia, as they struggled to free their country from the Soviet-equipped Vietnamese occupiers. Hence, two stark choices lay before the leaders of Singapore at that time. The first was to supply weapons to a coalition of fighters that included notorious figures, such as Pol Pot, who ruled Kampuchea with extreme brutality, leading to millions of deaths. The second option was to sit back while Vietnam violates the sovereignty of another country. During his speech at the inaugural S. Rajaratnam lecture in 2008, then Singapore President S.R. Nathan described Vietnam's invasion as an aggression that would have established an undesirable precedent if left unopposed, and that it is especially crucial for a small state like Singapore to make a stand on the matter. With this principle, Singapore secretly shipped the first batch of rifles to Cambodia in 1982. The matter was first disclosed by Kuan himself in one of his memoirs. Besides rifles, grenades, and ammunition, Singapore also provided training to the Cambodians on how to operate military communications equipment such as radio transmitters. Although Singapore did not admit to the transfers at that time, a Washington Post report in December 1982 managed to uncover these details, and it referred to Singapore as the first developing country to have established its own independent, internationally competitive arms industry. Together with the help that was secretly provided by other countries such as the US, the weapons supplied by Singapore had arguably kept the Cambodian resistance alive, despite the fight dragging out for several years after the initial invasion. Subsequently, over the years, Vietnam soon found itself internationally isolated, and Vietnam withdrew its forces from Cambodia after a 10-year occupation. Today, ties between Singapore, Cambodia, and Vietnam have largely normalized, and all three are member countries of ASEAN, an economically booming region that is set to outpace the rest of the world in economic growth over the next decade. But underneath the peace and prosperity across Southeast Asia, several conflicts have emerged that could potentially escalate into war. These conflicts include the South China Sea disputes, where ships from China have been actively embroiled in physical encounters with Southeast Asian vessels, including with vessels from Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. These encounters have gotten more intense in recent years and could easily spiral into an armed conflict if China does not back down from its claims. The question then arises, should war break out between the military powerhouse China and a poorly armed Southeast Asian state such as Malaysia or the Philippines? Will Singapore do what it did in the 1980s and secretly arm its fellow ASEAN state? Singapore's military-industrial complex has matured significantly since the 1980s. The country's defense prime, ST Engineering, no longer produces just rifles and guns, but also a variety of armored vehicles and vessels that have been exported the world over. Additionally, Singapore consistently has the biggest defense budget in the region, despite its status as the smallest country in Southeast Asia. Given this, Singapore is evidently better placed to act as an arms supplier should one of its ASEAN neighbors find itself embroiled in war with China. But herein lies a major difference between the South China Sea disputes and Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia. When Vietnam invaded Cambodia, it was a violation of internationally recognized borders. But for the South China Sea, Singapore has repeatedly reiterated its stance that it does not take sides on the merits of claims made by the various parties, and as such does not recognize any of the maritime borders claimed, including China's. In addition to that, unlike Europe, which has NATO, Southeast Asia lacks a military pact. ASEAN is largely an economic union and it does not cover military arrangements, except for the Five Powers defense arrangements that involve Malaysia and Singapore. Given this, it is unlikely that Singapore would repeat the role it played in the 1980s, unless Singapore's own interests are directly threatened by the conflict, which might include a blockade in its sea lines of communication. What are your thoughts about Singapore's role in ASEAN's defense? Do leave a comment below.